My dad called me on a Tuesday afternoon, and the second I heard his voice, I knew something was wrong. He tried to keep it light, said he'd had a little fall, said it wasn't a big deal. But my aunt was in the background and she wasn't keeping it light at all. And I could hear her telling him to just tell me, just tell her. And so he did. He'd fallen off the ladder while cleaning the gutters. His right wrist was fractured in two places. He was 63 years old and he lived alone in the house I grew up in, 40 minutes outside of Columbus, and he couldn't drive, couldn't cook, couldn't do much of anything with one arm in a cast up to his elbow. I hung up and immediately started thinking about logistics. I could leave Thursday, stay through the weekend, maybe into the following week. My job was remote, so that wasn't the issue. The issue was my husband. We'd been married for 2 years, together for 4. He wasn't a bad person. I want to be clear about that because that's what makes this so hard to explain. He was charming and funny and generous in the ways that were easy to be generous. He remembered my coffee order. He surprised me with weekend trips. He told people at parties that I was the smartest person he knew. But there was this other thing, this quieter thing that I had been trying to name for a long time without quite finding the right word for it. He had a way of making me feel like my family was an inconvenience, not in anything he said outright. It was more like a temperature drop, a stillness that came over him when my dad called, or when I mentioned wanting to go home for a holiday. A small sigh that wasn't quite a sigh. A comment delivered so casually that I'd spend the next hour wondering if I'd imagined it. I told him about my dad that night over dinner. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long are you thinking?" I said maybe 5 or 6 days, maybe a little longer depending on how my dad was managing. He nodded slowly, not the nod of someone processing information, the nod of someone deciding whether or not to say what they were actually thinking. "That's a long time," he said. I reminded him that my dad had a broken wrist, that he lived alone, that there was no one else who could really be there for him the way I could. "What about your aunt?" My aunt had 3 kids under the age of 10 and a full-time job as a school administrator. I said that. He picked up his fork and said, "I just think we have a lot going on right now." We didn't have anything going on. Nothing that required my physical presence in our apartment in Cincinnati. And I knew that. And he knew I knew that. And still, we both sat there while the words hung in the air like something we were supposed to pretend we hadn't heard. I went anyway. I want to say I didn't even hesitate, but that's not honest. I hesitated. I ran through the conversation in my head 40 times before I finally booked the train ticket. I thought about how quiet he'd be when I got home, the specific quality of the silence that was somehow louder than an argument. I thought about whether I was being unreasonable, whether 5 days was actually a long time, whether there was some way to shorten the trip without my dad suffering for it. I booked the ticket. 5 days. When I told my husband the plan, he said, "Okay." Just that. And then he went back to whatever he was reading. And somehow that single word, said in exactly that tone, made me feel like I had done something wrong, like I had failed some test I hadn't been informed I was taking. I drove to my dad's instead of taking the train. I'd changed my mind last minute because I wanted the flexibility of having a car in case he needed to get to a follow-up appointment or pick up prescriptions. My dad was waiting at the door when I pulled up, his arm in a sling, looking smaller than I remembered him looking. He'd lost some weight. I hadn't noticed over video calls. We spent the first couple of days getting into a routine. I cooked and did the dishes and helped him with the things he couldn't manage one-handed. We watched a lot of baseball. We talked more than we'd talked in years, probably because neither of us had anywhere else to be. On the third day, my husband texted to ask when I was coming home. I said Sunday, like we'd agreed. He said he thought I'd said Saturday. I pulled up our text conversation and sent him a screenshot. I had said Sunday. He replied with a thumbs up emoji. No apology, no acknowledgement, just a thumbs up. I put my phone down and went to sit with my dad on the back porch. He was trying to figure out how to hold a coffee mug with his non dominant hand without spilling it, and he was being funny about it, making a whole production out of the effort. And I laughed, and for a little while I stopped thinking about the thumbs up emoji. I came home on Sunday as planned. The apartment was clean, which surprised me. My husband had cooked dinner, which surprised me more. He was warm and attentive and asked about my dad and said he was glad he was doing better. It felt like being let back in from the cold. I told myself I'd imagine the temperature drop, the sigh, the one word texts. I told myself I was too sensitive. That's what I'd been telling myself for 2 years. The shift, when it came, was quiet. It always was with him. His mother called in October to say she was coming for Thanksgiving. Not asking, saying. She'd already bought a train ticket. She'd be arriving the Wednesday before and leaving the Sunday after. 5 days. The same length of time I'd spent with my injured father. My husband told me this over breakfast, like he was reading a weather report. I set down my spoon. I said, "Did you know she was planning this?" He said she'd mentioned it a few weeks ago. I said, "You didn't think to mention it to me?" He said he figured I'd be fine with it. I thought about my dad. I thought about that's a long time. I thought about that's a long time. I thought about the thumbs up emoji. I said, "Of course. I'll get the guest room ready." My mother in law and I had always had a relationship that I'd describe as cordially distant. She loved her son in that consuming, total way that left very little room for anyone else who loved him. She didn't dislike me. She just regarded me the way you might regard a piece of furniture that had appeared in a room without your input. Present, functional, not quite what she would have chosen. She arrived on Wednesday afternoon, and my husband transformed the moment she walked through the door. I don't mean this metaphorically. He was physically different, animated, louder, filling the room with energy in a way he rarely did when it was just the two of us. He carried her bags. He asked about her train ride with genuine interest. He'd already planned which restaurants they would go to, which things they would do while she was in town. I cooked the Thanksgiving meal, all of it. I want to be specific about this. The turkey, the stuffing made from scratch, the sweet potato casserole, the green beans, the gravy, 2 pies. I started the day before. I was still in the kitchen at noon on Thanksgiving while the two of them sat in the living room watching a football game and talking at a volume that made it difficult to concentrate. At dinner, my mother-in-law said the stuffing needed more sage. My husband agreed. I smiled and said I'd keep that in mind. On Friday, my husband took his mother out to do some shopping and I cleaned the kitchen alone and then sat at the table and thought about my dad making himself laugh over a coffee cup, and I thought about that's a long time. And I thought about how my husband had once told me that family was everything, said it seriously as a principal at his cousin's wedding rehearsal dinner, and I wondered if he'd ever meant for that to include mine. On Saturday morning, my mother-in-law came downstairs and told me she was out of her preferred coffee creamer and could I run out and get some. I looked at her for a moment. She looked back at me pleasantly, already turning toward the living room, the request delivered and therefore complete. I got my coat. I sat in the car in the parking lot of a CVS for 10 minutes before I went inside. When I came home, I put the creamer in the refrigerator and I went upstairs and I sat on the edge of the bed and I thought very clearly, the clearest thought I'd had in months. I am not going to keep doing this. That night, after my mother-in-law had gone to bed, I told my husband that I wanted to talk. He was in a good mood. He'd had a glass of wine, his mother was happy, the week had gone well in his estimation. He settled into the couch with the comfortable ease of a man who was not anticipating anything difficult. I sat across from him. I said, "I need you to understand something." He said, "Okay." I said, "When my dad broke his wrist, you made me feel guilty for going to take care of him. You said it was a long time. You made me feel like I was abandoning you for 5 days to go help a man who was alone and injured and couldn't take care of himself." He started to say something. I kept going. Your mother has been here for 4 days. I have cooked every meal. I cleaned the kitchen twice. I drove to CBS this morning because she wanted a specific coffee creamer, and you have not said a single word about any of it. You haven't thanked me. You haven't helped. You made me feel like choosing my family was a problem, and then you brought yours here and expected me to be their personal housekeeper. The good mood was gone. The comfortable ease was gone. He looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before, something between surprise and recalibration, like he was trying to find his footing on ground that had shifted. He said, I don't think that's fair. I said, I know you don't. He said I was making it sound worse than it was. He said he'd been stressed when my dad got hurt, that he hadn't meant anything by it. He said his mother was a guest, and that was different. I said my father was recovering from a broken bone. Your mother came here by choice because she wanted to. And you treated one of those situations like an imposition and the other like a holiday. He was quiet. I said, I need you to think about whether you actually see me and my family the same way you see yourself and yours. Because I've been telling myself for 2 years that I'm imagining this, and I'm tired. I'm genuinely tired. I wasn't crying. That surprised me. I had expected to cry, had braced for it, but the thing I felt instead of tears was something quieter and more certain. Like I'd finally said something that had been sitting in my chest so long it had formed a shape. He didn't say much after that. He said he needed to think. He said he didn't realize, and he left the sentence there incomplete, which I think was honest actually. I think he genuinely hadn't realized. The thing about that particular kind of blindness is that it doesn't feel like blindness from the inside. It just feels like the natural order of things. We went to bed not talking. His mother left Sunday morning, and I helped her carry her bags to the door. And she hugged me in her particular way, the kind of hug that starts ending while it's still beginning, and then she was gone. The week after Thanksgiving was hard, not explosive. Nothing dramatic, no ultimatums, no packed bags, just two people trying to look clearly at something they'd both been avoiding. He did more than I expected. He came home one evening and said he'd been thinking about what I'd said and that he thought I was right, and he didn't try to qualify it or negotiate it down. He just said it. I don't know what that's worth yet. I know what I need to see, and I know that real change doesn't happen in a single conversation in a living room. And I know that the feeling of finally being heard can be mistaken for the thing you actually need, which is to consistently be seen. But I also know this. I stopped apologizing to myself for having a family. I stopped running the mental math of whether my love for my father was a reasonable expense. I stopped treating my own needs like a budget item that required approval. My dad called the following Tuesday. His wrist was healing. He'd been cleared to drive short distances. He'd made himself eggs that morning, he said, with both hands, more or less. I told him I was really glad, and I meant it in more ways than one. I keep coming back to that CVS parking lot. 10 minutes sitting in a car I didn't have to park, staring at nothing, holding my keys. That's not a dramatic moment. Nobody would make a scene out of it. But I think about it more than I think about the conversation in the living room, or the thumbs up emoji, or even the Thanksgiving meal I cooked alone while football played in the other room. Something cracked open in that parking lot, not loudly, just enough. What I've come to understand is that the harm in a dynamic like that doesn't usually come from one big thing. It comes from the accumulation of small surrenders. A trip shortened, a need minimized, a feeling filed away under I'm probably overreacting. I did that for 2 years. And each time I did it, I was essentially teaching myself that my instincts weren't trustworthy, that the quiet, certain part of me that said this isn't right was the problem, not the thing I was reacting to. That's what I'd call a failure of self-knowledge, not stupidity, not weakness exactly, just a gradual erosion of the ability to trust what you already know. My dad raised me by himself after my mom left when I was 11. He never made a big deal out of it. He just showed up consistently in the way that mattered. Not perfectly, but honestly. When I drove to Columbus to take care of him after the fall, I wasn't doing something heroic. I was doing something obvious. He needed help. I was his daughter. That was the whole equation. And the fact that I had to spend weeks justifying that equation to myself, running it through some internal approval process, wondering if I was asking for too much, that's the part that still sits with me. There's a kind of courage that doesn't look like courage from the outside. It's not loud. It doesn't make a good story at dinner parties. It's the courage of saying, out loud and without apology, this is not acceptable to me, and meaning it, and not immediately walking it back when someone looks at you like you've said something unreasonable. That's harder than it sounds when you spent a long time in a relationship where your perspective has been treated like a position to be argued down rather than a truth to be taken seriously. What I said to my husband that night wasn't clever. It wasn't a prepared speech. I just said what was true, and I said it clearly, and I didn't fill the silence after with reassurances or qualifications. That was new for me. And I think that's the thing. Not the conflict itself, but the decision to stop managing someone else's comfort at the expense of my own clarity. My dad is doing better now. He made eggs with both hands. He laughed about it. That's the thing about the people who actually love you. They don't make you prove it first.